Second Corinthians chapter 10 is what we're going to discuss today. Now, this chapter is a little different, a little bit different direction than the last two chapters that we've seen in this book. Paul is going away from the idea of the charity and importance of giving and helping the Jerusalem saints and others. He's starting to deal more with the detractors in this chapter. So this is Paul's trying to rebut some of the people who aren't believing in him, who are trying to discourage people from following his ideas. So let's see what Paul is talking about in this chapter. Verse 1, "Now I, Paul, beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold towards you." So he's talking about, I'm trying to beseech you, encourage you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I'm not in your presence, so I'm going to be a little more bold because I'm not there with you. But hopefully when I get there, we got the bold part out of the way and I can be more meek with you. Verse 2, "But I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence, wherewith I think to be bold against some which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh." So again, there are some people who think Paul is not doing things for a spiritual improvement for the people, but physical gain. Again, they're not quite sure even about as we talked about the last two chapters, that there were some people who thought the donations gathered to Jerusalem that there was a margin being pulled off the top to enrich the missionaries. And he's like, no, that's not what's happening, guys. We're donating everything to the saints down there. We're trying to help them out. This is a pure act of selflessness on all of our parts. Please follow the advice and admonitions I'm giving you, basically. So that's where he's coming from. Verse 3, he says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds." So Paul, this is in the writings of St. Paul, Paul takes up military imagery often used in debates among philosophers, projecting a whole campaign in three successive stages: the demolishing of fortifications, the taking of captives, and the punishing of resistance. He depicts the stronghold of his opponents in terms typically used to describe the stoic sage, who used reason as a defense. Perhaps they mocked him the way some rigorous cynics used the image of Odysseus to attack easier rivals as underhanded. So that's the imagery. That's what we're going to be getting at here, is understanding this idea. So Paul's bringing in the concept of war and warfare to understand this debate between the Stoics and the non-Christian groups and the Christian groups, and who should you follow and work with. Now, the New Testament Study Manual also says Paul taught that though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. In our spiritual war against Satan, we do not use carnal weapons, meaning the weapons used in worldly battles, but rather we use spiritual weapons. Paul taught in this spiritual warfare, we must be careful of what and how we think. So that's another perspective of this, realizing that, again, Paul's trying to say what we're doing is different than what the world is doing. We're counteracting worldly challenges and bringing a spiritual component to this. Religious decisions, religious arguments can't be won on a battlefield. It's a whole different ball of wax, and we need to rethink what we're doing, basically, which is, in a way, kind of a mock of crusades, really. I'm sure these were some of the verses used against the crusades. So verse 5, "Casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God." That's that bringing it all down, taking what the enemy has that they think is amazing, and we're going to destroy it and bring it all down. That's like breaking the walls down so the army can get in. And then bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So all the thoughts you have, all the things that you're doing, realize we want to have a perspective of what does that mean in context of the gospel. So use, in a way, a hermeneutic or a point of view of how you do all things in the world to think about it from the perspective of, does this help me keep the commandments or break the commandments? Type of an idea is what he's talking about there. So that's this idea of bringing into captivity your thoughts so that they're pulled together and harnessed so that they don't, you don't get a bunch of wild thoughts, but keep them focused on how do we filter them through this idea of using the gospel of Jesus Christ. Verse 6, and having inner readiness to revenge all disobedience when your disobedience is fulfilled. So what, if you look at this verse, verses 5 and 6, this is what we had just been talking about. So casting down imagination, so the walls of protection that the enemy has, breaking those defenses down so that we can get in, taking the enemy captive so that we can help change and adjust what we're doing to do what's right, to change them so they're not going against us. And then having a readiness to revenge. So during war, there were sometimes people who would protest against the occupation of the winning army. And so he's saying in verse 6, that's the same idea of your disobedience. When you want to sin, when you want to do things that are against the commandments of God, that desire to sin is the thing that we need to eliminate. So he's using this idea of when you win a war against another nation and you destroy their city and occupy it and take it over, some are going to resist. Those are the ones that you put in jail or execute as treason against your new nation, and because now they're part of your nation. And so you get rid of those people. And that's what he's saying, the desire to sin, your disobedience, that's what you need to eliminate out of your life, is the desire to sin. So he's using these military analogies to talk about these ideas. Hopefully that makes sense and you can see that here. So now in verse 7 he says, do ye look on things after the outward appearance? If any man trust to himself that he is Christ's, let him of himself think this again, that he is Christ's, even so are we Christ's. So we're going to see this happen here. Paul's defending himself against those who opposed him. And we're going to see this as we continue on. Some of the criticisms leveled against Paul were personal in nature and were related to his physical appearance and his speaking ability. Such attacks on Paul's physical shortcomings demonstrate the weakness of his detractors' character. The scriptures contain many examples of the Lord using individuals with perceived physical weakness to accomplish his work. For example, Enoch and Moses struggled with physical challenges, like Moses and Enoch both had speech impediments. The Lord stated that the weak things of the world shall come forth and break down the mighty and strong ones. That's from the New Testament study manual. So we're going to see this as we go through. He's going to give kind of these ideas of some of the things that people are saying against him. Verse 8, for though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for the edification, and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed. Now the word boast in here means to glory or exalt. So for though I should glory or exalt somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification, and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed. So he's saying that we've been given authority, and the whole point of it is not to be overlords over you, but to help you. God has given us authority, meaning stewardship, to help you. That's an important point to think of with leaders. It's not authority over you, it's a responsibility to help you. So verse 9, that I may not seem as if I would terrify you by letters. For his letters, say they, so these are people complaining about Paul's letters, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Now, if all you knew about Paul was his letters, you'd probably say, this is quite a mighty dude to think of. And we might think of, oh, Paul's coming, but based on his letters, he seems pretty powerful. Well, when he shows up and you realize that Paul's short, Paul is actually a short person. He's probably 5'1", 5'2", maybe, not a really tall person. So he's short, even for Jews and Gentiles and people in that day and age. They're all, in today's world, we're all pretty tall. We're thinking like 6 foot is an average height. 5 foot would be more of an average height back then. So Paul's short, even for their standards. And he is weak. Now, the challenge we have in thinking about this is Paul actually had a physical disability. He had some challenges that he faced. And so sometimes people would meet him and go, that's Paul? Like, that's the guy that writes these amazing letters? We think he's, in our imagination, we imagine him to be this giant of a man. But he's sick and he's weak and he struggles with some physical maladies. They're comparing his physical presence to the spiritual message that he's giving, and they're devaluating or discrediting what he says because he's not a mighty warrior type person. If you think about this is interesting because we can see an analogy to this from the Old Testament. If you remember in the book of Samuel, when the Jews, not the Jews, but the whole tribe, all the tribes of Israel at the time, they came to Samuel and said, hey, we want a king. Everybody else around us has a king. We want to be cool like everybody else and have a king. And Samuel's like, no, you don't. You don't want a king. And they said, no, really, we do. We want you to go ask God if he will give us a king. And he's like, okay, fine. I'll go ask God. So he's like, God, they want a king. I tried to tell them no, but they wouldn't do it. So what are you saying? God's like, we'll give him a king. And Samuel's like, wait, what? It's okay for him to have a king? I thought kings were bad. He's like, oh, they are. They're bad. But they need to learn a lesson. In fact, give them Saul as their king. Saul was this mighty warrior. He had been in battles. He had been successful in many battles. He was this big, strong, burly guy, big warrior type person. That's the kind of king they wanted, not the kind of king they needed. They needed King David, who was short and not very big bulk-wise. He didn't have like a lot of muscles and things, but the dude was spiritual and smart. Saul, as you go through that story, you realize Saul had a lot of mental difficulties. That dude had some mental health problems. He had some narcissism. He had some maybe almost a sociopathic personality. He really struggled, and power just ruined it. When he had the power of a king, with his personality and struggles, man, he just used and abused it and became an onerous bad king for the people. And so that's the king they wanted on an outward perspective, not the king that they needed. And so that's what's, in a way, that's a similar thing that's happening here with Paul, is people are going, oh, we just think he's this mighty guy. And then it's a short person, when you think of this, even in the Star Wars lore, we think, oh yeah, Jedis should be these big warriors. We think of like Darth Vader as this tall, big, burly guy. They promote this power, but yet the most powerful Jedi was also the smallest of them, Yoda. So size isn't a big deal. And in fact, Yoda brings that up when he's trying to train Luke on Dagobah. He's like, does size really matter? Look at me, my size. Does that mean I can't wield the Force as good as you because I'm smaller than you? But yet Yoda then lifts his whole the whole X-Wing out of the swamps and moves it over to dry land, So there's this challenge that sometimes we have a perception that physical size must mean greatness and abilities, and it really doesn't. And that's what some of these people are dealing with here, is they thought this must be a great man, but yet they see him and go, that's Paul? That's this guy that's writing these amazing, powerful letters? What? So in their mind, again, they have an expectation, and Paul's not meeting their external expectation. And so they're discrediting him. Rather than say, you know what, maybe my expectation is wrong, maybe I need to change, they're discrediting Paul, saying, oh, his messages can't be that important anymore because he's a short person. That's what they're saying. And that's the problem that we still have fundamentally in the world today. Their opinion's not important because they're a woman, or they're Asian, or they're black, or they are poor, or they don't have a successful job. We don't take their advice. So that's the problem, is there's a difference between what they're saying, the truth of what they're saying, and who they are. And oftentimes we discredit the truth of what they're saying because of who they are. And we need to realize that sometimes what they're saying means more than who they are. And we need to realize that. And that means change on our part. And that's the hardest thing to do, is change yourself. But that's what the whole point of the gospel is to change yourself. Change yourself. So verse 11, let's continue on here. He says here, let such an one think this, that such as we are in word by letters when we are absent, such will we be also indeed when we are present. For we dare not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves are not wise. So again, they keep thinking you've got to be powerful physically to be powerful spiritually. No, you don't. They're applying a false conception. Okay, sometimes outward appearance is deceptive. Sometimes this happens in church congregations where we feel like we have to meet a standard of dress or a standard of conduct to be included. And we don't. We shouldn't have that. That's an artificial thing, false tradition. And that's what's happening here. So comparing themselves to others, saying, I'm better than you because I'm stronger or I'm taller or I dress better or whatever, that's all baloney. Okay? And that's what Paul's trying to say, guys. Don't get into that trap. That's just a terrible trap to get into. Verse 13, he says, but we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. We're not measuring ourselves based on your perception. We're measuring ourselves based on what God wants us to understand. We're using his ruler, not yours, to judge things. So that's a good thing to think about. Are you using a worldly ruler or God's ruler to judge and evaluate things in your life and to judge God and his message in your life? Verse 14, for we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure, as though we reached not unto you, for we are come as far as to you also in preaching the gospel of Christ. So we're not trying to conform to your ruler, your standards, your ideas. Verse 15, not boasting of things without our measure, that is, of other men's labors, but having hope when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you according to our rule abundantly, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line of things made ready to our hand. But he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. That's the real trick. Follow what God's rule is saying. Follow his ruler. Measure things by his marks, not the worldly ones. That's what he's saying here. In fact, in November of 2010, there was a great article in the Ensign magazine about pride in the priesthood, and it says, Paul said of his detractors that they commend themselves and are therefore not wise. Paul suggested that we should not praise ourselves, but should instead seek the Lord's approval. President Uchtdorf of the First Presidency taught about pride that is related to self-commendation. He said, at its core, pride is a sin of comparison. For though it usually begins with, look how wonderful I am and what great things I have done, it always seems to end with, therefore I am better than you. When our hearts are filled with pride, we commit a grave sin, for we violate the two great commandments. Instead of worshiping God and loving our neighbor, we reveal the real object of our worship and love, the image we see in the mirror. Pride is the great sin of self-elevation. This sin has many faces. It leads some to revel in their own perceived self-worth, accomplishments, talents, wealth, or position. They count these blessings as evidence of being chosen, superior, more righteous than others. This is the sin of, thank God I am more special than you. At its core is the desire to be admired or envied. It is the sin of self-glorification. That's the problem that the Corinthians have, is they keep trying to do this. They keep trying to measure up by their own standards. And they measure up. The problem with measuring by your own standards is your own standards are biased to favor you and not others. God is trying to say, let's bring this to an equal level here. Let's use a third party, which is God. We can trust God to be honest and have integrity. We use his ruler to measure us. And that will change and realize we both need to repent. We both sin in different ways. We need to be better inside. We need to be willing to make changes. That's the problem, is they're not wanting to change. They want things to conform to their views. That's the challenge that Paul's facing with these Corinthian saints. So let's jump over to the next chapter, as we continue forward.